Now because it is a demonstration of atmospheric pressure. You see, ladies and gentlemen and boys and girls, what I'm trying to do is not teach any physics in these recitations, but rather stir your interest by events which are dramatic for the soul. Here is a sheet of paper, about 20 inches one way and 30 the other, 600 square inches. On each square inch, 15 pounds of air. 600 times 15, 9,000 pounds of air. And you know, as I did before, I'll do it once again. I cannot move the weight of that air. There it is. And I say that is staggering to contemplate, the push of the air.
Hey, what's up everybody? John the Morgile here, back for Section 3 of The Globe is Dead. Picking up where we left off in Section 2, obviously with pressurized suits in space, and then the temperature flux in space. The problem is a non-pressurized spacesuit would expand to extreme levels when exposed to a vacuum. This goes back to the relationship between, pressure and density. A pressurized suit would explode when exposed to a vacuum. The only way to prevent this would be to have an extremely strong suit made of structural metals, designed to withstand the tremendous outward pressure to prevent it from exploding, or to ensure that the interior of the suit is pressure neutral to the exterior of the suit. So in other words, the interior of the suit would need to be a vacuum in order not to explode, and that certainly is not what, conducive to the astronaut inside, and that's not what they claim to do. And nor, of course, such a thing would not be feasible for the human inside the suit, of course. But pressure differentials have nothing to do with how slowly you repressurize an environment either. That's just what makes it safe for living organisms to transition from, say, a low-pressure area to a high-pressure area without suffering dangerous consequences of such an abrupt change in barometric pressure known as the bends, or pressure sickness. The point is no matter how slowly you depressurize an area on the ISS to allow for spacewalks or moonwalks, or, from the capsule, the alleged pressurized suits would inflate and explode due to the complete lack of barometric pressure in the alleged vacuum of space. Truly, the only sort of spacesuit that could withstand existing within the vacuum would need extreme tensile strength and should be designed to inflate to many times its normal size in order to prevent inevitable catastrophes due to wear and tear on the materials, just due to flux of use, making up the spacesuits which don't exist. So the simple fact is that astronauts are faking spacewalks from within large water tanks containing replicas of the space station right here on Earth in the confines of top-secret government installations. Does anyone find it odd that not one single astronaut in space has experienced a loss in pressure of their imaginary spacesuits? And, this would be a common occurrence if you think about it, but we know they're lying about this because the spacesuits should look like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, or, like the Michelin Man, or an immovable cast iron suit to withstand the immense disparity between the interior pressurized suit versus the exterior vacuum. But instead, we see the same old plastic fabric sort of suits which hold their form in an alleged vacuum, proving conclusively to me that NASA is lying and spacewalks must be faked using CGI or simply shot in an underwater tank using their standard spacesuits, which are designed to hold firm under high pressure underwater and are not designed to inflate or designed to explode to compensate for zero pressure outside of the suit.
Now, commence Operation Vacuum Suck.
As the great late Nikola Tesla stated, there is no energy in matter other than that received from the environment. The Space Power Facility at NASA's Plumbrook Station, Sandusky, Ohio, is the world's largest and most powerful space environment facility. Located on a 6,400-acre property, construction costs, upkeep, and maintenance are astronomical. Even one would think it to make perfect sense to have astronauts train here and prepare them for the supposed vacuum of space. No astronaut training is going on here. The enormous vacuum chamber makes a high vacuum, which is 3 levels before the supposed much higher vacuum of outer space, as we can see here. Considering that the suits these guys here are wearing reminded me of one thing: bubble wrap. Now let's see what happens to bubble wrap if we put it in a table vacuum pump.
Oh my God, look at it! Woo! Oh my God, look at it!
And for anybody who has any doubts how powerful a vacuum can be and what it can do to a puny tin can of a spaceship, a wimpy space suit, or a small leak even in outer space, check this out.
We're loading 42-inch 480 wall steel pipe, 3 to a truck. Pipe are about 40 feet in length.
Artificial gravity failure.
Shit.
We're loading them with an vacuum attachment on a 450 John Deere hoe. Pipe weigh about, I think I said the pipe weigh about 9,000 pounds a piece. This vacuum attachment will pick, this one I think will pick 30,000 pounds. That's 15 tons just on a vacuum.
The ridiculous spacesuits, which the Hollywood and NASA Freemasons like for us to accept as real, would suffer the same fate in the vacuum of space as bubble wrap in a tabletop vacuum chamber, being popped and depleted of oxygen instantly. And seeing as the human body mainly consists of water, the following clip will demonstrate what would happen to these astronauts.
You can see a little bit of bubbles start going, and whoa, it started boiling. How cool is that?
But the ultimate and most dangerous test was a huge, specially constructed vacuum chamber.
They were able to pull all the air out to create a big vacuum. That way we could test our suits to make sure there was no leakage.
One such test narrowly avoided disaster. Jim LeBlanc was the test subject in the vacuum chamber.
This is one of the rare instances where they tried to use a spacesuit in a vacuum chamber, but quickly realized that it's impossible in a high vacuum, so they immediately started using swimming pools to train and remained silent on the absence of vacuum chamber training by astronauts, which basically is a lie by omission.
As I stumbled backwards, I could feel the saliva on my tongue starting to bubble just before I went unconscious. And that's kind of the last thing I remember.
Essentially, he had no pressure on the outside of his body, and that's a very unusual case to get, and there's very little in the medical literature as to what happens when you have that. There's a lot of conjecture, that your fluids will boil,
You can see a little bit of bubbles start going.
I could feel the saliva on my tongue starting to bubble.
They weren't able to construct proper spacesuits, and they didn't want their spacemen to get boiled, so they went to the swimming pool.
Here's where they simulate fixing a space shuttle, fixing the ISS, or working with other modules.
It's the same as far as every rail, as far as every bolt, as far as where every rail should be in place. They have to go turn a bolt 98 times, space.
And which ISS module is in the pool right now?
Pretty much everything that we have in the pool except for the Russian segment.
They went from a no-pressure environment to a pressure environment, which makes no sense and simulates zero gravity only and exclusively for the camera.
I'm astonished by how difficult it is to actually move around. The idea, like from the movie Gravity, that you could like reach out and grab something with one of these gloves? No way. Not gonna happen.
Now came the most critical part of the mission. Two space surgeons began a complicated operation to replace several black boxes buried inside the satellite. After slicing open the skin, they disconnected hundreds of wires and then reconnected them, using the cargo arm as a moving work platform.
Cut these wires to pick this guy up here. Okay, that's it's a little bit more. So we can see your hand now. See if we can see your thumb. So we can see your hand now. See if we can see your thumb. So we can see your hand now. See if we can see your thumb. Okay, well that's a good scan of it. Yeah, I got them cut just now to get these.
It was the biggest test so far of man's ability to use his hands and his brain together in space.
This is from the helmet-mounted camera, just how many wires are in there. I don't even know how many there were, but there's a whole bunch of wires.
This is the part I think I mentioned to you folks. If there was anything I really didn't think that we might be able to do, it was to change out all these little electrical connectors, and these guys made it look like a piece of cake, just like they'd been doing it all their lives.
There's 11 connectors, and each one of them had up to like 78 wires in it. So, but it turned out to be, after all the training we did earlier, wasn't very difficult.
I'm astonished by how difficult it is to actually move.
It wasn't very difficult.
I'm astonished by how difficult it is to actually move.
It wasn't very difficult.
Difficult.
It wasn't very difficult.
They have to go turn a bolt 98 times.
That you could like reach out and grab something with one of these gloves? No way. Not
side of the suit. To give you a final example, the most commercial jetliners have pressurized cabins, which allow for a more comfortable flight without problems that come from abruptly changing the pressure of one's environment. Although whenever I've flown, I've got a major problem with my ears popping. When I was younger, I smacked my head on the surface of a water falling off of a jet ski, and it felt like someone was stabbing me through the brain for like 2 weeks. I had a pretty bad inner ear infection, and so flying on planes does bother that for me. So the point is even in a pressurized jet or a pressurized cabin, you still do feel the effects of the exterior pressure. Now, for argument's sake, if the jetliner were made of a flexible material like rubber, the jetliner would indeed expand as altitude is gained, much like a weather balloon, as the interior pressure, staying the same, would be greater than that of the exterior pressure, and this would be proportional, of course, with altitude. The exterior pressure decreases, and so you have an expanding of the interior gases due to the lack of inward push from the ambient atmosphere. Now, if the same hypothetical pressurized rubber plane, inflatable airplane, or expanding airplane, this is just for shits and giggles here, but if it were placed in a perfect vacuum, the flexible material would expand greatly and eventually explode naturally to find equilibrium with its environment. The simple fact that spacesuits are not made of reinforced steel, nor do they expand wildly and contract once they're back, in the pressurized environment, depending on whether they're inside the pressurized ISS or outside of the vacuum of space. These suits always remain sort of the same size, and this is very damning evidence against NASA's validity in their claims that they go out into this vacuum of space. This should really be apparent to any honest observer who studies, even in a very cursory sense, studies barometric pressure and pressure differentials and how that affects things, how that affects objects and suits, and what sorts of materials would be needed from an engineering standpoint to withstand a near perfect vacuum. Now, I hate to say it, but NASA has everyone, for the most part, fooled about the whole spacewalk, moon landing thing. And of course, the whole colonizing of Mars propaganda that has taken many people deeper into the deception is, of course, just more hogwash. It's
that we don't have everything that we need to get humans to Mars.
It's propaganda and it's deception. The other thing I mentioned was temperature variance on the spacecraft, or flux in temperature on the spacecraft, or flux in temperature on the lunar surface. So the temperature variance, or the flux in temperature on the ISS, for example, in the so-called thermosphere, should experience a flux in temperature so great from day side to night side of the Earth, changing from one to the other every 45 minutes or so. The materials exposed to these major fluxes in temperature should expand and contract due to how objects or how materials react to changes in temperature. Now, of course, the vacuum environment, they claim, naturally would compel any pressurized area to expand. However, this would be exacerbated by flux in temperature from day to night. Expanding and contracting, occurring once every 45 minutes from one extreme to the other, to an observer in the hypothetical ISS. Now, people argued that since the ISS is in the thermosphere and the molecules of atmosphere are so sparsely spread out, they're so far apart, that the area is not affected by conventional heat transfer. The problem I have with this claim is that the ISS itself is not made up of molecules so disparate that they cannot hold or transfer heat energy. And in fact, the ISS is made up of dense metallic molecules, if we're going to use that terminology. Metal is known to be an excellent conductor of heat, radiation, and electric currents, and since the heat collected by the metallic craft cannot be transferred to its environment due to the sparsity of particles admittedly or allegedly in the thermosphere, the heat energy accumulated over the years has nowhere to go but to be stored somewhere on the ISS. The ISS should be like a broiling oven in reality. I'd really love to know how the ISS, or NASA claims the ISS, manages to cool itself when it's on the day side of the Earth for about 45 minutes in temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. What sort of designs went into building the ISS to account for the unknown manner in which materials would behave when exposed to such incredible temperatures and then dropped way over to the other end of the scale every 45 minutes? You know, such fluctuations in temperature many times daily over the course of, 15 years, I don't know, 18 years, however long they claim it's been up there, a long time, longer than, it's admitted or its shelf life when it was constructed. It wasn't even supposed to be up there but for a few years, and yet here we still have it. Furthermore, what about the electrical buildup on the ISS? Everyone knows that electrical system must be grounded out. Airplanes, for example, store their electric buildup in a capacitor, which is grounded out every time the plane lands, releasing all of the electric potential. Now, if airplanes didn't do this, if it didn't land, or if it didn't ground out its electrical systems when it lands, eventually the buildup of static electric charge would short out all of their circuitry. Now, the ISS has never landed. It's never grounded out. And so, how have they managed to accomplish this without an infinite upgrade to their storage capacity in terms of, electric capacitors? The Apollo astronauts claim to have walked around on the day side of the moon. Although it has no atmosphere, the lunar surface should have been over 250 degrees Fahrenheit on the day side, negative 250 on the night side. We'll cover this in more detail later, but I wanted to mention this as pressure, temperature, and structural design are all critical components of any theoretical space travel or a visit to the moon. A pressurized airplane is constructed of extremely sturdy materials to prevent the plane from expanding and contracting due to changes in pressure and temperature. Now, the same cannot be said about spacesuits. Furthermore, the Apollo missions were not equipped with some magic materials that could withstand 250-degree temperatures for extended durations, especially considering the moon has apparently no atmosphere to protect the surface area from the so-called deadly radiation coming from the sun itself. In truth, when the astronaut hopped off the little module, the crazy lunar module, he said,
"One silly hoax for man, one giant leap for a liar."
Or something like that. What should have happened was once the hatch was opened, the astronaut's suit should have instantly expanded like a balloon, then exploded. Then the astronaut himself should have expanded like a balloon and exploded. All of the rubbery, stretchy parts of the space suit should have began melting upon the lunar surface, and the gory remnants of the astronaut should have been sautéing under the ladder, all before he could utter one small. Really, the famous word should have been "one bloody mess," coming from the guy who watched him hop out of the landing module. That would be assuming that they had a way to depressurize only the environment which the guy hopped out of, but of course they were both allegedly depressurized in the same environment, so they both should have exploded and there shouldn't have been any words at all. Unless he kept his suit on the whole time and put it down to a negative or a vacuum neutral pressure inside, which means there wouldn't have been any air in there for him to breathe, so he would have, that still doesn't work, but anyway. I've heard it argued that the downward pressure of air upon an object at sea level, being about 14 to 15 pounds, again, per square inch, is canceled out or negated by the air displaced or the buoyancy of the object. Now, there are some important variables involved, obviously, such as the density of the object, the density of the air, the total surface area of the object compared to or relative to the object's mass, and most importantly, the horizontal cross-section of the object in relation to its overall mass. So, a physical principle which must be understood and applied to construct ships made out of hundreds of tons of steel that float on water, and airplanes made out of, tons of materials that fly through the air. In order to get those to work, these principles must be applied. For example, a single flattened out sheet of paper will experience a similar downward pressure of the air above.
I do this now because it is a demonstration of atmospheric pressure. You see, ladies and gentlemen and boys and girls, what I'm trying to do is not teach any physics in these recitations, but rather stir your interest by events which are dramatic for the soul. Here is a sheet of paper, about 20 inches one way and 30 the other, 600 square inches. On each square inch, 15 pounds of air. 600 times 15, 9,000 pounds of air. And you know, as I did before, I'll do it once again. I cannot move the weight of that air. There it is. And I say that is staggering to contemplate.
A single flattened out sheet of paper will experience a similar downward pressure of the air above, yet will experience less buoyancy than a granite cube with the same upper surface area. So in other words, a granite cube is going to displace more air than a sheet of paper with the same, 2D dimensions. Now, of course, the granite cube will weigh more as it's more massive and of a higher density. However, the buoyant forces exerted upon the stone will be greater than that of the sheet of the paper, as the stone displaces more air than the paper. Even with the aforementioned variables involved, I believe the claim of buoyant forces exerted upon an object at sea level, negating the downward push of a column of air rising miles overhead, should be questioned, as objects weighing slightly less at higher elevations due to lower barometric pressure is a fact. So it really leads me to believe that the downward push is of extreme significance in terms of rendering mass with weight on a scale. In other words, the downward pressure of the atmosphere is greater than the buoyant force under most normal circumstances we're familiar with in the troposphere. or the lower layer of atmosphere above the face of the Earth, rich in oxygen and carbon dioxide, amongst other gases. But there are, of course, exceptions, like a helium balloon or a hot air balloon, but for all intents and purposes, atmospheric pressure is the dominant force pushing down compared to the upward buoyant force, or the atmosphere displaced by an object. And, of course, a helium balloon or a hot air balloon are acting in accordance with the laws of density and buoyancy, and so seem to defy, or at least bend, the rules of gravity, again damning to the heliocentric scenario and showing that gravity doesn't exist. I think it's worth mentioning that space could not be a vacuum, regardless of the shape of the world. A vacuum is the absence of pressure, while the world is abundant with pressure. One of the fundamental laws of fluid dynamics is that a vacuum cannot exist adjacent to a pressurized fluid or gas. The vacuum will always essentially consume the pressurized fluid or gas until an equilibrium is formed. Theoretical physics must assume that equilibrium is caused by gravity. However, the allegedly weak force of gravity couldn't possibly hold a single molecule of disparate gas fixed miles above the Earth adjacent to such a powerful, perfect vacuum. This is an impossibility so great that the heliocentric model should fold on this one single fact alone. Yet, for some reason, scientists believe gravity is strong and structural, separating the vacuum of space from the atmosphere somehow, and somehow smart to separate the vacuum of space from our upper atmosphere, right? So it's got to know where space begins and where the atmosphere ends. Yet, such a scenario cannot and will not ever be demonstrated in reality, where you can show an object generating gravity or generating a pull towards itself. You can demonstrate magnetic forces doing such things, but certainly nothing akin to gravity. So, in the heliocentric model, all of the atmosphere and oceans should be sucked into the infinite void of space until every last bit is depleted from our local area and then eventually spread out evenly across the infinite vacuum of space. Even highly paid, Harvard-educated theoretical physicists on advisory boards for NASA will claim that the theory of gravity provides the necessary boundary to separate our atmosphere from the vacuum just beyond the atmosphere. But if you give this even a bit of thought, you'll realize the argument is indeed preposterous and couldn't possibly be true, as gravity has never been attributed to a structural mechanism to separate a vacuum from a body of gas. Not to mention, gravity is alleged to be the weakest of the so-called natural forces. I would say it's so weak that it doesn't exist. However, assuming for argument's sake that gravity is a warping of space-time, as alleged by Albert Schilstein, the amount of gravity experienced by, say, a cubic meter of atmosphere will vary depending on altitude. Gravity is supposedly relative to the mass of two objects, in this case the oblate pear-shaped apple-bottom Earth and a cubic meter of atmosphere, hundreds of miles away from the Earth's surface. So a cubic meter of atmosphere near the ground will be affected more by the theoretical pull of Earth's gravity, since it's closer, than a cubic meter of atmosphere, say 50 miles up, due to the greater distance to the Earth and the lower density of the higher altitude mass of atmosphere. So gravity is supposedly directly related to proximity and the mass of two objects. The greater the distance between the two objects, the less gravity. The lesser the mass of the object, the less gravity would be experienced. So a very distant, low-density object would experience far less gravity than a high-density object near the Earth. Furthermore, in accordance with the laws of density, you will find less and less dense gases relative to altitude. So as altitude is gained, not only does the air get thinner due to less air per cubic meter, but you also find lower density gases and layers in those regions as well. This means the pull of gravity, again humoring the ridiculous theory of globism, the pull of gravity upon a cubic meter of atmosphere adjacent to space would be far less potent relative to a cubic meter of atmosphere adjacent to the ground near sea level, and for multiple reasons. So we're expected to believe that an unproven and actually disproved absurd theory allows basic laws of physics and fluid dynamics to be broken just to suit the theory that the Earth is a globe spinning in a vacuum. We're expected to believe that gravity is not strong enough to hold a helium balloon near the ground in the thick, dense troposphere, yet gravity is strong enough to hold a single molecule of gas adjacent to the strong vacuum of space. Furthermore, we're expected to believe that this single molecule of gas is also compelled to spin in sync with the ground many miles below due to the conservation of angular momentum, breaking the laws of rotational body as a fixed frame of reference, which was described earlier. Give me a break, seriously. But this is what Globers believe. Does anyone else see how preposterous this all is, or is it just me? Is this beginning to make sense to some people? I hope. I would say these are shocking examples of how science has failed to remain objective and skeptical when considering basic premises involved with heliocentrism. This means that the scientific method is not actually being followed, and the theoretical physicists, therefore, have failed humanity through nothing less than willful ignorance and arrogance and an adherence to a dogmatic belief system. The abundance of such oversights and misunderstandings and really just obvious things that were missed by professional scientists and astronomers are so bountiful. My ability to be surprised by the ignorance and arrogance of theoretical physicists has been whittled down to essentially zero. In other words, I wouldn't be surprised if theoretical physicists claim tomorrow that dark matter has been proven because
our model doesn't work without dark matter. Therefore, dark matter has been proven. You see, we know the Earth is a globe spinning in a vacuum, so in order for this cracked out idea to work, we must have gravity. Gravity is what causes my feet to remain stuck to the side of a spinning sphere zipping east at 1,000 miles per hour near the equator, vertically dropping around that curve at 135 miles per hour, while the Earth goes 66,000 miles an hour around the Sun. Gravity is what causes our planet to orbit the Sun and the Sun to orbit the galaxy. Gravity also provides an impenetrable barrier between the vacuum of space and our upper atmosphere, contrary to all logic and proven laws of physics, but hey, who cares about any of that? Dark matter must be there because there's no physical medium to counterbalance the enormous centrifugal forces attributed to any of the spinning and orbiting bodies in space. A perfect vacuum certainly cannot be used for any sort of structural mechanism. We must have sort of a tether between the Sun and the Earth for their orbital relationship to work. Therefore, dark matter is a proven fact or a law of physics. Dark matter must exist in order for our model to work. Therefore, dark matter is proven to exist because we'll never reconsider our model, and we'll spend all the money in the world to prove dark matter, even if we never prove it. Ever, 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 ever.
For all intents and purposes, this is exactly what theoretical physics has done, and organizations like NASA and CERN and the Russian Space Agency, all of the world space agencies, they're just spending untold billions of dollars trying to find evidence, or make-believe trying to find evidence for undetectable gravity and its invisible evil twin, dark matter. I should mention very quickly that anyone who would like to comment something like,
jump off a building and then tell me gravity doesn't exist,
or
drop a brick on your foot and then you've proven gravity.
In case you're one of those people, both of these examples are demonstrations of the law, what goes up must come down. This is a law of physics based on repeatable demonstration and is not debated. Gravity is a theory to explain this phenomenon and therefore cannot be proven by a demonstration of the law gravity was designed to explain. What goes up must come down is not exclusive proof that the world is a spinning sphere, and in fact, the law of physics, this particular law of physics, what goes up must come down, is absurd if you consider the world to be a spinning sphere. I would say what goes up must come down is exclusive proof that the world is a stationary plane and not a spinning sphere, if I'm being honest. Highly paid parrots of scientism will use the demonstration of what goes up must come down to prove gravity, yet gravity is merely a theory to explain this observation. The observation is not proof of the theory of gravity. Roll the slinky clip. All the while, a simple curvature test or an honest, skeptical observation of high-altitude weather balloon recordings will immediately end the hunt for gravity and its mysterious, non-existing counterpart, dark matter, as the entire set of theorems are only necessary in a scenario where the world is a spinning sphere, which it obviously is not. Just as an example, I remember being told when I was young that the limit to our field of view near the ground, if you're, high up on a mountain, is about 20 miles in any direction, depending on topography, of course, due to the curve of the Earth. And if you're standing at the sea, you can see out about 3.5 miles. And that's all, of course, due to the curve of the Earth. Now, even though you can see mountain ranges hundreds of miles away from certain vantage points, I thought it was interesting and assumed it was true. This whole, you can only see 3 miles from sea level, or you can only see 20 miles from a high elevation due to the curve of the Earth. Never questioned it. Now, throughout school, high school, throughout college, I studied physics, math, geometry. Never once were the topics of Earth curvature or the measurements to determine such a thing discussed. The fact is, there is no measurable inverse square declination upon standing water or flat plains of Earth due to this very elusive Earth curvature we've all been taught to believe exists. The curvature of the Earth seems to have always been an assumed fact, just as sure as what goes up must come down, strictly because our secular views are founded upon the assumptions of ancient philosophers. By the way, these ancient philosophers did not have the ability to test many of their theories, such as send up a weather balloon, or fly a plane, or understand electromagnetism, or whatever, instant communication. The more you look at this rationally, the more you'll find throughout the history of science simply assuming or the presumption that the Earth is a sphere to reach the ultimate conclusion that the Earth is a sphere. Such assumptions are what give us the estimated distance to the Sun and the circumference of the Earth. Any scientific testing to either support or discredit the Earth's curvature has been completely omitted from all scientific study, including geology, astrophysics, theoretical physics, and even architectural plans involving long bridges, canals, or railways. So none of this is ever mentioned, brought up, it's never studied, but during my junior year of high school, we literally built miniature rockets, which we launched near the end of the year. But never once did we discuss or attempt to measure the curve of the Earth over the course of my entire education. And I think that goes for pretty much everyone. This is a tragedy, as the word geometry etymologically translates to measure the Earth. How ironic is that? I'm 100% certain that the only time the topic of the elusive, non-existing curvature of the Earth was discussed strictly in the context of ridiculing the truth, which is the Earth is a stationary plane, but never in terms of actually measuring for this curvature or proving the curvature exists by experimentation or observation or, measurement. Never happened. So what is so ironic is the fact that people so firmly believe that they live on a spinning sphere, they will use hypothetical theory, which is dreamed up to support such the belief system, such as gravity, as proof of their belief system. Again, not arguing the fact what goes up must come down. The only way this sort of observation would be possible on a spinning spherical reality would be if you had something like gravity, an attractive force towards the center of the spinning ball to counteract or negate the centrifugal force created by a ball spinning about 1,000 miles per hour near the equator, not to mention walking around on the sides of any object that's spinning without some sticky substance or fastener on the bottoms of our feet. But again, this entire argument or frame of mind requires the presumption that the Earth is a spinning ball in the first place. What goes up must come down actually works quite nicely when you consider the reality that the Earth is a stationary plane without any bizarre, unproven theorem such as gravity to make it work in theory. And this perfectly illustrates the utter disconnect between theoretical science and reality. You cannot take a theory to explain an observation, then use the observation to prove the theory. In other words, what science has done is taken the obvious observation, what goes up must come down, and explained the phenomenon away, since the Earth is supposedly a spinning sphere, with the idea of gravity as an attractive force between masses. Then, people somehow believe that pointing to the original observation, what goes up must come down, somehow proves the imagined theory explaining the observation as to somehow prove the theory. This is not science, and dropping a brick on a foot is a demonstration of what goes up must come down, and is not proof of gravity. Uneducated goat herders thousands of years ago thought the Earth was flat, and if they traveled too far, they'd fall off the edge. This is another example of how propaganda and misinformation has helped the cockamamie heliocentric theory to survive. Backwards thinking, broken logic, and self-reinforcing belief systems have prevailed throughout history into the 21st century. Public schools are operated by federal authorities, just as NASA is operated by federal authorities, both of which are cranking out propaganda to perpetuate the unquestionable belief in space travel and spherical worlds in space. The federal government has plenty of motive to perpetuate this lie. Think of what would happen if thousands of people conglomerated for a complete geodetic survey of the Antarctic. Our entire modern paradigm is based on the assumption that we're all insignificant. The world is insignificant, and even the Sun and theoretical Milky Way galaxy are relatively insignificant in the grand scheme of things, according to the infinite space heliocentric model, which is shown to be fallacious by the lack of Earth curvature and axial rotation and all the other things I've mentioned so far, in many other videos as well. By keeping our eyes to the sky and filling our heads with romantic science fiction propaganda, the federal government has created a multifaceted, fail-safe brainwashing program which systematically manipulates our minds into agreeing with ridiculous theorem and considering them laws. Most of us spend the majority of our lives working and sleeping, so we don't really have time or proper motivation to skeptically investigate or second-guess what we've learned in the federal mind control programming for at least 13 years of our lives, starting when we were about 5. Those who have dedicated their lives to theoretical physics may spend an additional 4 to 8 years on top of that being more heavily indoctrinated with the idea of infinite space and the heliocentric lies. And, by the way, spending those 4 to 8 years extra, they still don't measure for the Earth curvature or axial rotation. They just assume that it's there, and are therefore far more entangled in and mesmerized by the ridiculous fantasy that is heliocentrism, and simply cannot be bothered with such petty experiments to verify or falsify the Earth's necessary curvature or axial rotation. Whenever real physical experiments are conducted to detect curvature or axial rotation of the Earth, the experiments fail and align with the fact that the world is a stationary plane, the exact contrary to a spinning sphere. So, which side do you want to stand on? The side backed by dogmatic beliefs based on assumptions and theory, or the side based on demonstrable facts, repeatable experiments, and an unbiased view of all the evidence? For a theoretical astrophysicist, it's nearly impossible for them to review this in an unbiased sort of way, and so it's nearly impossible for them to realize the truth, as their entire field of study is based on such theoretical principles deemed laws, which are never to be questioned or objectively scrutinized. You know, it really is a shame, but again, I'm talking about people who will ridicule me and label proponents for this obvious truth as anti-scientific morons. We're testing hypotheses and performing experiments in order to support or falsify a given theory, and are consistently coming up with results that are patently incompatible with the current accepted model of the universe. Indeed, I feel bad for such hypothetical egomaniacs, as their ignorance and arrogance make them blind to the obvious truth, but the same ignorance and arrogance make them biased observers, and so it is extremely difficult to suspend their assumptions, blocking any chance of a realistic understanding of our true place in the universe, which is central, special, and unique, as opposed to insignificant, tiny, and irrelevant in the grand theoretical scheme of things in the Copernican principle universe. Unfortunately, the universe as we're taught does not actually exist. The idea of an infinitude of galaxies, stars, and planets like Earth are a sort of mass hypnosis, a figment of the collective imagination, ushered in by the federal system especially, controlling our minds for the majority of our lives. The idea of other galaxies didn't even exist until 1920s. People such as Lawrence Krauss, Neil deGrasse Tyson, or Josh Grindley would immediately dismiss the idea that we don't live in a galaxy, and galaxies as they understand them don't exist. They would dismiss this idea without any consideration, as it violates their belief system and the Copernican principle. Now, the last time I checked, science was supposed to be a process of testing theories, especially if they challenge existing belief systems. Scientific progress hinges on this objective quest for truth, yet theoretical physics is so far removed from the realm of reality or science, they are not even in the same ballpark.
Ain't the same fucking ballpark. It ain't the same league. It ain't even the same fucking sport.
Using this quaint, dusty old process of inquiry and testing theorem, my entire worldview has been completely overhauled in the last year and a half. Once introduced to the concept of a static plane Earth as an adult, it took me about a week to drastically alter my entire worldview and accept the fact that theoretical science has gotten it all wrong, specifically theoretical physics and astrophysics. We've been trained very well to assume the Earth is a sphere in outer space and will autonomically focus our efforts to support this worldview, no matter what, regardless of the evidence shown to the contrary. This is because, up until now, most of us have had zero motivation to revisit this topic and skeptically analyze our worldview as rational adults. All of the ideas which we must hold in terms of the world, the sun, and the universe must be so drastically altered to come to terms with the truth, and it takes a personal commitment to reevaluate the so-called laws of globe Earth physics, which always begin with the assumption that the Earth is a spinning globe, and end with theological, fallacious, self-fulfilling proof that the Earth is a spinning globe. Such a self-gratifying process is exactly the same sort of folly as claiming that raisins are the droppings of flying woodland pixies, the proof of which is, well, obviously raisins are the droppings of woodland pixies because NASA said so. Also, raisins exist, duh. How could raisins exist if it weren't for the fairies that excrete them? NASA would never lie about this, so do you have any proof of the fairies, though? Well, of course not, but we have all our brightest minds in the world searching for them. Right now, we're developing technologies to locate the pixies, even if they're invisible and very small. As absurd as this sounds, the hunt for gravity, dark matter, and Earth-like planets are by far more foolish. You certainly could convince a child that raisins are indeed such a fantastic phenomenon, much like you convince them a fairy trades them a quarter for a lost tooth. But what if nobody ever told the child it was a lie? What if all the mainstream voices in the world repeated the lie continuously, obliviously, across all media, from education to science, science fiction, corporate logos, to the so-called space exploration agencies, to, everything in between? Talking points like global warming and global positioning systems, which to me, GPS stands for ground-based positioning systems, but anyway. So, the insidious nature of the lie involved with the spinning globe, infinite space, quote-unquote reality is an illusion and a trap for our minds, which funnels in everyone to wholeheartedly believe in a really quite absurd theory, as it is taught uniformly across the entire culture, reinforced by all forms of mainstream media, targeted at all audience demographics. Our natural want to explore and seek out new frontiers has been misdirected towards the mysterious lights in the sky, instead of focusing on realistic goals which should begin with abolishing the Antarctic Treaty and proceeding outward across the Antarctic and/or Arctic regions. This is the ultimate reason for the brainwashing of all people into the globe. It puts us on an inescapable speck residing in the infinitude of space and dissolves any beliefs we might otherwise have had that imply our world is somehow special or unique. Infinite space is a fantastic facade which allows for our minds to wander into the deepest reaches of impossibility, in terms of galaxies, planets, and aliens, etc. It's really all very romantic and certainly fills the void left by Santa and the Tooth Fairy, but is unfortunately just another contrived belief system forced upon us by the cult of scientism, who must never be questioned about their dogmatic set of beliefs. I should quickly add that Halloween has always been a lot of fun because Dracula was a real guy, right? Vlad the Impaler, and mummies are real, and shapeshifters are a serious possibility in the infinite space hypothesis. It seems that for whatever reason, our modern culture is designed to associate Christianity with myths like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, and I don't see that as by accident. I would even go so far as to say that the spherical Earth, infinite space, and all of the trimmings that go with it are nothing less than the Great Deception. The 666 connection is certainly there in triplicate in terms of the sphere and some of its attributes. For example, the distance in miles squared multiplied by 0.666 gives you the expected vertical drop due to curvature in feet. So if you're looking at an object that's 25 miles away, to calculate the expected vertical drop due to curvature would be 25 times 25 times 0.666, and that would give you the expected result in vertical droppage due to curvature. Another one is the supposed average speed of the Earth is 666 miles per hour around the Sun, and of course the hypothetical sphere Earth is supposedly tilted at a 66.6 degrees from the horizontal axis of the ecliptic. Anyway, we're all capable of being deceived by some fairly ridiculous lies, especially when we're vulnerable little children. Unfortunately, some of these lies, such as gravity and the spinning sphere Earth, are huge, bold-faced lies masquerading as verified scientific fact, and neatly fill a void in our minds which grows with the thought of just how insignificant the entire world must be. Our explorative, pioneering spirit has been collectively refocused on the unobtainable lights in the night sky and redirected to ponder science fiction as proven fact. The fact is, our world is a stationary plane, and the celestial bodies are secondary, tiny bodies, or if bodies is even the right word, they may not even be physical objects, but very tiny in either way, relative to the massive stationary physical plane of reality. So instead of focusing on practical sciences, some of our brightest minds are wasting their lives studying the so-called galaxies and stars, with a completely misguided understanding of the very fundamentals of reality. They believe the stars are suns and galaxies light years away, when in fact the stars are merely lights in the night sky, which to date have not, which to date do not have a complete explanation. Globers will claim the burden of proof is on us to prove and explain every last detail of everything, including what the sun and stars are made of, as if they have a viable answer for either of those. We'll get into the theoretical hot atomic fusion later if I haven't already covered it, but in truth we must only disprove one single facet of the accepted model to debunk the whole thing, and the burden of proof is now on the Globers to show evidence for overall Earth curvature or axial rotation just for starters. And, by the way, claiming that the stars and sun are proven to be atomic fusion is malarkey, as the specific type of atomic fusion attributed to the stars is theoretical and cannot be demonstrated in reality. Atomic bombs appear to be a hoax, and atomic energy is a misnomer. All of the theoretical sciences fall apart under close inspection when we remove the globe-colored goggles we've worn our entire lives. But for Globers to claim that they know what a star is, and they know what a star is made of, and they know what, they know that it's hot atomic fusion taking place is hogwash. Globers claim that the Earth spins over 1,000 miles per hour near the equator, which means that an observer there would be traveling faster than the speed of sound compared to an observer at the North Pole. Again, the observer at the equator would be vertically dropping along the curve of the Earth at about 135 miles per hour in conjunction with the eastward 1,000 mile per hour velocity resulting from simple axial rotation at the equator. Now, in the morning, this hypothetical observer on the equator of the spinning sphere Earth would experience the ground beneath his feet racing upward towards his legs at about 66,600 miles an hour. 12 hours later, the same observer would experience the Earth racing down away from his feet at 66,600 miles per hour, an overall acceleration from one extreme to the other over 130,000 miles per hour from morning to evening, and we don't notice it. Now, this would be much like standing on the nose of a speeding bullet versus standing on the back of a speeding bullet, only a much, much faster bullet or missile. Using the same observer at the equator during the night, he can look north and see the central North Pole star. 12 hours later, before dawn, the same observer can look in the exact same point from his vantage, from his perspective, the exact same point north, and see Polaris in the exact same place at the center of all the other stars' apparent rotation. This observation would be physically impossible in the heliocentric model, as the observer would have traveled 12,500 miles along that curve and would be facing in opposite directions in the universe from dusk until dawn when facing north on a spinning sphere. Proponents for the globe argue that we don't observe major stellar parallax, or the stars don't change their relative positions based on the mind-boggling distances between them, or the disparity in the distances between them. However, this argument has nothing to do with that premise. It has to do with the direction we're facing in space and the angle of our line of sight constantly changing from one extreme to the other over the course of an evening, and indeed from summer to winter, which is another layer of this topic disproving the Earth's orbit. Our line of sight towards the stars would be a tangent to the curve of the spherical Earth, so an observer at the equator facing north at dusk would be facing in one direction, and 12 hours later would be facing in the opposite direction. When you consider the geometry involved, objectively, the North Pole star couldn't possibly be visible in the same exact spot in the sky from dusk until dawn as observed at the equator, nor could it be visible in the same spot in the sky from winter to summer. This is indeed the case, however. This is what we see, and it is incompatible with the heliocentric model. Polaris ever remains stationary, more or less, in the sky, fixed above the central axis, according to anyone who can observe it. This proves the Earth is stationary, and it is the stars which are apparently spinning around Polaris. Furthermore, it proves the stars must necessarily be closer than we're told in the heliocentric model, as you can triangulate on its position from dusk until dawn, facing north without budging your telescope over the course of an evening, even from near the equator. Assuming a spinning spherical Earth, this would only be possible with relatively close stars, which is simply not compatible with their model either. Globbers argue that we don't feel the alleged motion of the Earth that I've been discussing due to us being fixed to the same frame of reference with the Earth, and that the Earth spins and moves at a constant speed so it isn't felt by us. An example of this poorly thought out argument would be, when you're flying 600 miles an hour in the plane, do you feel like you're flying 600 miles an hour, or do you feel stationary relative to the plane? Of course, we don't notice the tremendous speed within a plane, as the plane is ideally enclosed and pressurized, but the passengers are in a seated position fastened to the plane. Once the acceleration and rapid ascent of takeoff are completed, passengers can walk around on the plane as if it's stationary, as they are indeed fixed to the frame of reference with the primary object traveling in a more or less consistent velocity and not experiencing too much acceleration. If that plane makes a slight bank or encounters a minor change in air pressure, or encounters turbulence at high speeds, the passengers obviously notice this, especially if they're walking around, and anyone not strapped down will be tossed about during a heavy turbulence, as it is acceleration or change in that constant velocity that is felt, not a constant uninterrupted motion or fixed frame of reference. So to put this in globe Earth terms, if the plane were flying 600 miles an hour, spinning on its horizontal axis, so like constantly doing a barrel roll, considering the nose of the plane the axis, doing 600 miles an hour along a great curve, so constantly banking left, and ascending at, say, 5,000 feet per second vertically, the passengers on that plane would not only feel it, they would be a sopping pile of goo and bones by the end of the flight. The argument that we don't feel the motion of the Earth because it's a constant speed or a fixed frame of reference is unfounded and ridiculous. For one thing, a rotational frame of reference is not the same thing as a linear frame of reference. A plane flying straight at 600 miles an hour would represent a linear frame of reference. The gravitron at the fair or a merry-go-round would represent a rotational frame of reference, which always creates centrifugal force or an apparent push away from the axis. Standing at the equator, an observer is not just supposedly
traveling at 1,037.5 miles an hour east, but also vertically dropping or falling around that curve at 135 miles an hour.
Furthermore, due to the alleged orbital motion of the Earth, at sunset, the Earth is allegedly racing down away from your feet at 66,600 miles an hour. 12 hours later, in a perfect world at sunset, the world would be allegedly racing up towards your feet at 66,600 miles an hour. At midnight, the Earth would be flying from west to east under your feet at 66,600 miles an hour, and at noon from east to west under your feet at 66,600 miles an hour, which all needs to be added to or subtracted from the spin of the Earth described earlier. Every second of the day would be unique, and we would necessarily experience so many different phase shifts in our inertia relative to the spin and relative orbital path of the Earth. All of these extreme, velocities, often in contradiction, constantly changing. For a stationary observer at the equator, it would be obvious. Look out your window, look at the sky, and honestly ask yourself if you believe all of this motion is taking place. At the same time, we must remember the sun is allegedly flying around a curve at about 483,000 miles an hour in a great circle around the galactic center in a 250 million year cycle. This is, of course, theoretical, as nobody has ever observed this cycle. The heliocentric model claims that our ecliptic, or the orbital path of the Earth, is misaligned to the galactic plane, or the sun's orbital path, by about 60 degrees, meaning we would necessarily experience all sorts of acceleration here on our little spinning ball based on variable conditions in the sun's orbit, compounded by the Earth's orbit, compounded by the Earth's spin. And finally, the galaxy itself is alleged to be flying through space. It's away from the center of the Big Bang, or towards the Great Attractor, depending on who you ask, at some untold millions of miles per hour. So again, the argument used by many globbers pertaining to the motion of the Earth, likening the world to an airplane flying at a fixed velocity, are merely parroting what they've heard and have not actually thought this through objectively. The world is very obviously stationary, and there are basic observations and even physical experiments which can be repeated to show that we're not spinning, nor are we flying around the sun. Ergo, the heliocentric model is crapola.
Hey everybody, and real quick while you're still here, I just wanted to mention that a lot of subscribers of mine have been complaining that they're getting unsubscribed from my channel without them knowing it or doing it, and I'm just seeing every time my subscriber base starts to grow a little bit, they'll just start disappearing by the hundreds. So if you've been subscribed to my channel, just double check, make sure that you are still subscribed, because you may not be. And for those of you who aren't subscribed, don't forget to. So anyway, just thought I'd get that in there real quick. Just wanted to thank all y'all for tuning in to section 3 of the documentary series, The Globe is Dead. I've already got part 4 pre-recorded, so hopefully I'll have that out within the next week or two. Thank you all so much again for hanging in there and joining. I hope this was helpful. I hope this was informative. And at the very least, I hope this helped you to question your beliefs. So until next time, Spread the word, spread the world, and peace.